Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to another tutorial video. As I'm sure many of you know by now, I am a particular fan of the Hornby J94 and Austerity, which you can see here. It's a relatively old model now, it has its origins back with Dapple, but amazingly it's still in the Hornby range today, albeit for a much higher price tag than it was back then. But despite that, there is something so charming about these wonderful little shunting locos that I can't help but love, and the thing especially that I love is the slow speed and controllability. If they do have one major disadvantage though, it's that because they're such old models, they are not DCC ready. And that essentially means that you can't just take the body off and plug a decoder in like you would with most modern locos. Now, I'm gradually moving all of my models over to DCC, but I couldn't leave one of my favourite locos behind. And so I've decided to hardwire decoders into all of my austerities. In the past, this used to be a little bit more tricky than it is today because the decoders that we had back then, while they weren't massive, they were a bit bigger than what we tend to have nowadays. However, times have changed and it's actually relatively easy to now fit one of these for DCC, and today I'm going to show you how. So welcome to the workbench, and firstly I'm going to quickly go through all the things we'll need to carry out this decoder installation. The most important tool when we're hardwiring a decoder is a soldering iron so we can connect the wires. We also have the decoder itself, which we'll be installing in the loco, and a screwdriver for dismantling it. A knife will also be useful too for cutting down some of the wires. Likewise, a helping hand will make things a bit easier, and some insulation tape is a good idea to have around as well. Last but certainly not least, we have the loco itself, and that's everything you need, so now let's get on with the installation. So here's our Hornby J94 Austerity model, and this is one of the newer ones that came out a few years ago, although this process should be exactly the same no matter how old your model is. And this is the decoder I'm using, which is a Zimmo MX617F. You don't have to use this particular one though, any small wired decoder should do. The first thing to do is dismantle the loco, and we start by unscrewing the funnel, which comes off nice and easily. Next, on the underside, there are two screws at the back under the cab which also need to be removed. These can just be tipped out and then put to one side. We will have a lot of screws to keep track of during this, so I would recommend having somewhere to put them. In my case, I'm just using the package that the decoder came in. Finally, there's one more screw at the front of the loco in this little recess. I'm not actually sure if this makes any difference, but I'd take it out anyway just in case. Then we can remove the top of the saddle tank and cab. It might take a little bit of wiggling, so be careful here, but as you can see it's not too difficult to remove. Now we can see the big metal weight that usually hides inside the loco, and this is partly what gives the loco its incredible slow speed. We do need to remove this as well, and you can see the two screws that hold this in place. Now in the past we did have to grind away part of this weight in order to make space for the decoder, but as you saw the one we're using is quite small, so we shouldn't need to do that anymore. With the weight removed we can now see the motor. There are two mounting brackets holding this in place which we also need to take out, so you guessed it, more screws to remove. The first bracket comes out pretty easily. I just use the screwdriver to maneuver it up and then take it out. As I remove the screws on the second bracket, you may notice the red wires going through the hole in the centre. Again, I use the screwdriver to lift the bracket up, and now we can remove the motor from the loco. We will need to remove those two red wires before we can continue though, so taking the soldering iron, I just touch the tip to the tab on the motor and the wires should come away. Now we can remove the mounting bracket and put that to one side. Then turning the motor over, we need to do the same with the black wires too. Again, touching the soldering iron to the tab, the black wires should come away. If you're lucky, the two wires will stay soldered together, but in this case that didn't happen. So now let's prepare the decoder, and the first thing to do will be to cut off the plug since we'll be hardwiring this to the pickups and the motor. Since I'm not adding sound or lights to this loco, we won't need all of these wires. The ones we will need are the red and black that come from the pickups, and then the orange and grey that go to the motor. This means that I can cut off the yellow and white wires, as these will just be taking up space otherwise. The blue wire can also be removed too. Now, this might be a little bit of overkill, but I'm just wrapping the ends in insulation tape here so that they don't accidentally come into contact with any metal parts of the loco. The final bit of the decoder preparation is to expose the ends of the 4 wires we have left. You could use a wire stripper on these if you're feeling brave, but as they're so thin and delicate, I find it much easier to do this with the knife instead. Just press down lightly on the wire, enough to cut through the plastic sheath but not the wire strands inside. Then drag the knife to the side and you should fairly easily be able to expose the end. With the decoder ready, it's now time to start attaching some of those wires to the motor. Firstly, I'm going to tin the ends of the wires just to give them the best possible connection. And you'll find that the helping hand is really useful here for holding the delicate wires and stopping you from burning your fingers too. We then need to solder the orange and grey wires to the 2 tabs on the motor, which again is fairly straightforward. For the grey one, I do need to remember to thread the wire through that mounting bracket that was holding the motor in place earlier on. With the wire through the hole in the centre of the bracket, I can then solder this to the remaining tab on the motor. And again, just a quick touch of the soldering iron is all it needs. The decoder is now attached to the motor, so next we need to solder the red and black wires to the loco and its pickups. Now those 2 black wires that we removed from the motor earlier did come apart, so I just need to reattach those to make things a bit easier. To do this, I'm simply twisting the 2 bare ends of the wires together, and there's enough solder still on the ends that a quick touch joins them back together. So now I'm going to clip the 2 red pickup wires on the loco into the helping hand, and this is just to keep them out of the way of the rest of the chassis so I don't accidentally melt something with the soldering iron. I then take the red wire from the decoder and solder this to the red pickup wires. And just be patient with this. It might take you a couple of tries, but you really want to get a nice solid connection that isn't going to fall apart. Next we'll repeat this process and solder the black pickup wires to the black wire on the decoder. Now I believe some of the earlier Hornby J94s only have black pickup wires and not red on one side and black on the other. If you do find that, you'll just have to be careful to keep the 2 sets of wires separate so you don't create a short. But the process is the same, it's just that your red wire from the decoder will go to one of the sets of black wires instead. Incidentally, the decoder wires should always be these colours as long as it's NMRA compliant, which nearly every decoder is these days. And in my experience, even those that aren't still follow this basic colour pattern. So now you can see I'm just covering up those solder joints with a little bit of insulation tape. Again, we don't want these joints to touch anything metal on the loco, the decoder, or to come into contact with each other either. So that is the scary bit done now, and the hard work is over. Before we fully reassemble the loco though, I do think it's a good idea to make sure everything is working as expected. I am going to put the motor back in place to do this though, so that mounting bracket just slots over the back of the motor and then we can push it into place in the chassis. It can be a little bit fiddly getting everything in the right place. Don't worry about the decoder so much right now, just make sure that the wires are running under that bracket and that the red and black wires are either side of the motor but not getting in the way. And then we can just reattach the bracket by replacing those screws we took out earlier. You can see the decoder is just hanging out the front of the loco at the moment, but that's fine for me as I'm going to test this loco on the rolling road. So here is the rolling road, which is hooked up to my DCC controller, and we'll get the J94 Austerity on there too. I use the Rocco Z21 controller, which allows me to run locos using my phone, and as I turn the power up, you can see the wheels on the loco start to turn. And yeah, everything seems absolutely fine there. Now, you may find that the loco travels in the opposite direction from what you intend, so the loco runs backwards when you select forwards and vice versa. Now that's because the orange and grey wires we soldered to the motor earlier on are the wrong way round, but don't worry, this is an easy fix. One option is to unsolder those wires and swap them round, or you can do what I do, which is to change CV29 on the decoder, and this will invert the direction the loco travels. But the loco is running exactly as we expected it to, and most importantly, as you can see here, the slow speed is still really good too. So, now that we know everything works, it's time to reassemble the body. The first thing I'm going to do is wrap a small amount of insulation tape around the decoder itself, which will just keep it protected. Next up, I'm going to put the second motor bracket back in place, and again this is just a simple task of dropping it in and replacing the screws. The next step will be to put the weight back in, but before we do that we need to fit the decoder in place. You can see there's a handy space here at the front of the loco, and the small Zimmo decoder fits in nicely. And I'm just wedging it in using the tape so it's not rattling around loose inside the body. With the decoder in place, we can sit the weight on top and then again screw it back down to attach it to the loco. And you may find here that some of the decoder wires are poking out from underneath. That's fine, just carefully push them back in using the screwdriver. So now it's time to put the body back on. I actually like to separate the cab from the saddle tank here, as I find it much easier to get everything back in place this way. You may need to do a bit of wiggling here to separate the two pieces, but if you're careful, the cab should just come off. We're going to put the saddle tank on first though, so we'll just push this down into place, and it should be fairly straightforward as there isn't anything obstructing us. We can then replace the funnel and screw this back into place. This is actually moulded to fit over the saddle tank, so make sure you get it the right way round here. The cab can be a bit more tricky, as it needs to not only slot over the saddle tank, but also line up with the clips on the chassis. It might take you a few goes to get it in the right position the first time you do this, but I've done 3 or 4 of these locos now, so I've gotten fairly good at figuring out where it needs to go. Now we'll just replace the screws underneath, first starting with that recessed one in the hole at the front of the loco. And then finally we'll put in the 2 screws at the back that hold the cab in place. These can be a bit tricky to get in, but luckily my screwdriver grips onto the screws quite nicely, which does make it a lot easier. And with that, the loco is now fully reassembled with the decoder fitted inside. So let's get it down onto the layout and see it run. So here it is in the station, and you can see here as it starts moving, we still have that really nice controlled slow speed. If you like how the Hornby J94 Austerities run on analog power, then you'll be glad to know that they run exactly the same on DCC too. And just to be clear, I still haven't changed any settings on the decoder here. Everything is still set to the defaults, including the loco address. So there we go. These models may not be the newest in Hornby's range, but with a decoder fitted, they'll now have a new lease of life on my DCC powered layout. And if you've been thinking about converting your own Hornby J94 Austerity to DCC, I do hope you found this tutorial useful. As long as you're comfortable with the soldering iron, it should be no problem, but really it is a fairly simple little project. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon too. But that's going to be it for this time, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!